welcome back to the final part of chapter 7, and basically I just saved the best for the last, right? Okay, so what about governments? What about government policy? How does government policy or government actions basically affect the financial markets or the loanable funds markets? Okay, so government basically, or the role of government comes in the financial markets when the government is running a budget surplus or a deficit. So remember we said a budget surplus is the point where the government's revenue, which is basically taxes, is greater than its spending. Okay, so that is good. So I'll just put a happy face here. And a budget deficit is when the government is actually spending more than it's earning, so the revenue is less than G. So I'll put a sad face here. Okay, right. Now, if the government is running a government budget surplus, what happens is that it increases the supply of loanable funds. Okay, so if there's a government budget surplus, this will increase the supply of loanable funds because we take it as sort of saving. The government is basically saving after spending, after earning and spending. What is basically left over is basically a savings, okay? Right? But if the government is running a deficit, it means that the government is actually borrowing. Okay, so this actually increases the demand for loanable funds. Remember I said demand for loanable funds is basically synonymous with borrowing, okay? Right, so now let's look at how the government basically affects financial markets. Now, in looking at how government affects financial markets, there's one thing we should note. We want to differentiate what happens when the government actually enters the markets plus what happens in the private sector, okay? So, we have our normal loanable funds markets with a real interest rate over here. We have the loanable funds over here. We have demand for loanable funds over here. And now we have something interesting because we're considering governments. We have what we call the private supply of loanable funds, okay? Right. So that is just put there to differentiate between the private sector and government, okay? Right. Now, suppose government enters the market somehow because the government is actually running a budget surplus. This will actually push the supply of loanable funds to the right because it's an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Okay, so you have an entirely new supply of loanable funds over here. But again, this is different from the private supply of loanable funds. Okay, again, what will happen? Interest rates will fall. Okay, investments will increase because again, you move along the demand for loanable funds curve. Okay, so investments will increase. But interestingly, now we can see what will happen to private savings in the economy. For some reason, because the government's budget surplus has pushed interest rates down, private savings in the economy will now decrease because this is the new interest rate at 5%. Okay, so private savings will now decrease. They'll move from this point to this point. Okay, so essentially there's a decrease in savings, right? Whilst there's an increase in investments, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so now we actually see what happens to private savings when government basically enters the market. Okay, when government basically enters the market. Okay, now what if the government is running a budget deficit? The current United States government is running a budget deficit. What happens? Well, again, we need to differentiate between private demand for loanable funds. So private is basically households and businesses. And when the government basically enters the loanable funds market when it's running a budget deficit, okay, it pushes the demand for loanable funds curve outward to the right. So you have an entirely new demand for loanable funds curve over here. But at the same time, we still have our private demand for loanable funds because we want to see what happens in the private sector, okay? Well, we know that the interest rates will rise, okay, and the quantity of savings will rise as well, okay, because again, you move along the supply curve, okay, so you move from this point to this point, and the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases as you move upward the supply of loanable funds curve, so savings increase, okay. But the interesting thing is that you can clearly see that over here at the interest rate of 7%, the private demand for loanable funds actually decreases. And when private demand for loanable funds decreases, investment basically decreases, and that is what we call the crowding out effect. Okay, the crowding out effect. Okay, so the crowding out effect happens when investment in the private sector decreases because the government is running a budget deficit. When the government is running a budget deficit, generally interest rates increase. When interest rates increase, it becomes more expensive for firms to actually borrow. So in that sense, investment basically decreases. Okay, right. So that is basically the government in the loanable funds market, or how the government affects the loanable funds market. Okay, now we have something we call the Ricardo-Barrow effect, and the Ricardo-Barrow effect is rather interesting. Well, the Ricardo-Barrow effect, is named after David Ricardo. He's an 18th or 17th century economist, and Robert Barrow, who is pretty recent, of Harvard University. They came up with the idea that, you know what, government budget deficits and government budget surplus basically don't really do much to the economy or to the loanable funds market. Why? Because think about it. If the budget deficit happens, okay, well, what will happen is that, yes, the demand for loanable funds here will actually shift out, okay, but remember, we actually live in a country where people pay taxes, okay? So if the people know that the government is running a budget deficit, it knows that eventually the government will like to close that budget deficit, and in the future will actually increase taxes. Well, if in the future taxes are going to be increased, you know that you have less disposable income, okay? So in the future, or if expected future income is going to be less, right, you decide to save more today. So at the same time, whilst the government is running a budget deficit, people increase their savings because they know that taxes will increase in the future, till the point where you get to a new equilibrium over here, right, where nothing happens to interest rate. The interest rate stays the same, but due to the increased private savings, okay, the amount of loanable funds in the market basically increases, okay? So due to increased private savings and due to the increase in the demand for funds, okay, the amount of loanable funds in the market basically increases, and people's savings are used to finance the deficit, okay? So that is known as the Ricardo-Barrow effect. So the Ricardo-Barrow effect says that nothing happens to interest rates when the government is running a budget deficit, right? Because people will save more and actually balance that out. The only thing that will happen is an increase in the amount of loanable funds, okay? So essentially that ends our chapter 7. Again, please watch the video, pause it when you have to. If you have any questions about anything, please don't hesitate to ask me or send me an email or meet the essay, okay? I hope you guys have a really good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday, okay? Take care. Best. Bye.